In 2011, an up-and-coming horror director called Adam Wingard made his debut feature film, a home invasion horror movie called You're Next. Much like many of his contemporaries like Ty West, Joe Swanberg and Mark Duplass, Wingard was part of a new movement of horror filmmakers that brought a mix of 80s nostalgia and mumblecore naturalism to horror.
You really gotta just zing the ideas on in there.
That's why I watch TV these days.
That's why I mean, it's better than the shows.
Gone were the dingy, grainy aesthetics and new metal soundtracks of the 2000s. Here we got vibrant, colourful visuals and 80s synthy electro pop.
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes?
My name is David.
A couple of years later, Wingard followed up You're Next with The Guest, which brought even more of those neon-drenched 80s visuals and synthy soundtracks to the horror genre.
How do you do that? You get used to it.
With this 1-2 hit of successful genre films, Wingard proved himself to be one of the most important voices in 2010's horror, someone who would help usher in a new golden age of the genre. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss Adam Wingard's You're Next and The Guest. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season exploring the evolution of home invasion, and this is part 25. We've reached the 2010s, and this week we are going to be discussing, as that intro suggested, 2 films from director Adam Wingard, You're Next, and The Guest. What a fun double bill. Please do check both films out if you get a chance before you listen to our discussion, as this conversation will, of course, be spoilerific. So, joining me to discuss these 2 movies, I've got a long-time friend of the pod. He is an actor, a podcaster, a writer, among many other things. He's supposed to be here by now. I'm not sure where he is. He was last here in our vampire series discussing Buffy and Angel with me. Oh, he's knocking on my bedroom window. Okay, this is just something he does. I forgot about that. One sec. Josh Tonks, hello.
Hi.
Oh,
sorry.
You're right. Just take my hand. Here we go. No, that's just a plant pot. Don't worry about it.
It's a little bit difficult coming through. I mean, you've got rid of the ladder and...
Yeah, sorry about that. Oh, don't worry about that. That's fine.
Coming up the rose trellis is so much harder than I remembered.
Yeah, you could just use the front door next time. But anyway, let me just close the window. One sec. There we go. Right, Josh, take a seat. How are you? How are things?
Yeah, things are good, thank you. Yeah, I've been away all summer at summer camp, and now I'm back in London and back in the day to day, and we're having our second summer, it seems, which is very muggy and very sticky.
Oh my god, it is hotter than the sun right now at the time we're recording this. It's horrendous, yeah. Well, excellent. Well, let me start off. I'm really excited to discuss these 2 movies with you. This is going to be a lot of fun. Let me start off by asking you a bit about home invasion itself, Josh. What do you think of this kind of subgenre? Would you say you're a fan?
Oh yeah, huge fan. I love home invasion, and it's been really interesting listening to the podcast and listening to this series in particular, because so many people's reactions have been, oh my god, terrified. It's the scariest one. I really struggle. And I think I really, really enjoy it. I really like it. And I think what I've discovered in my own personal journey through horror is that home invasion it's almost as close as you can get to slashers, which I love.
Yes.
But they're not quite as repetitive. Mm-hmm. And I think, I don't know, there's just something... I don't know, maybe like a little bit more serious about them as well. Like, yeah. I've learned that the slashers that I love the best are either like the proto slashers, the ones that came before, so the sort of Black Christmases, Halloween, even something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, really. And then the sort of later high concept ones, so things like The Final Girls, and that's sort of where my faves lie. That's sort of my favorite dare I even say, it might be my favourite subgenre. I love it.
Oh, I love this. You might be the first person that's actually said this
I
whole
know.
series. So that's quite nice. But I agree with you, especially some of the really fun, scary ones. Like, I know you love, or at least love, the opening, right, to When a Stranger Calls.
Oh,
which
yeah.
is like, that is an all-timer for me in terms of like home invasion movies. Even that opening as like a little short film,
Perfection.
right? Incredible. Yeah.
That, and then I love to do a little back-to-back of that and When a Stranger Calls Back. And,
Oh
you
my
know,
God.
when I've done like Halloween screenings and stuff, I'll just show those two openings back-to-back. And people get so scared. It's probably like, I don't know, it's probably one of the scariest things put to screen. It's so tense. And I think as well as a you know, as someone that works in film and like, you know, aspires to make more horror movies, I think what I like about Home Invasion is that they're small, they're one location, and so there's a level of like aspiration to them. Like, I can realistically make these, and so I find them quite inspiring to watch as well.
What do you think does separate like the good home invasion movies like that from the bad ones? These kind of single location kind of cat and mouse thrillers, because obviously there's a lot of quite bad or bland ones too, right?
Yeah, it's really hard to do, and I think we'll get onto this when we talk about our second film. Look at me trying to keep it secret, like people haven't like clicked the button knowing fully.
Little tease. Yeah.
Fully well. But when we get to our second film, I think a lot of it comes down to the director and the eye and the style. You know, what works so well with When a Stranger Calls is it's making the micro macro. So it's like it's focusing on the smallest of details, whether it's like the turning of a door handle or, you know, a shadow in the background. It's those things, and making a meal out of them, because you don't have the time or the money to like go to a new location or, you know, reset something up. You've got your one space and you have to make the most out of it. And I like that. I like that creativity. But on the flip side, in the wrong hands, there can be loads of padding. It can be really, it can be quite boring. It can feel really flat. And so I think it's got to be a good... You've just got to have people at the top of their creative game. Acting as well, like the actors need to be really in it, because there's going to be so much of them. You know, it's not going to be, and now we cut to our supporting characters, and now we cut to this. It's going to be you the whole time. And so
it's true.
A lot of focus on very small details.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference between this and slashers, right? We'll probably talk about this a lot as we go, especially with your next. But like the kind of fine line between what is a slasher movie and what is a home invasion movie. But I think with slashers, you can rely a bit less on having really well-rounded characters or whatever, because you're just throwing in loads of gore and kills and scares, right? Whereas home invasion can't just rely on that. A lot of the time, it's just like The Strangers, for example, it's just two characters, right? So you've got to make that work and make it last.
Yeah, and you sort of have to be invested in them. And I think with a lot of those 2000s home invasion movies, you find that like the first act or even longer run the risk of being quite boring, because not a lot's happening, because there'll be nowhere to go. And so you have to find a way of either making us really invested in the characters, which I think The Strangers does quite successfully with the really heartbreaking marriage proposal gone wrong, and then the same in the sequel as well, having sort of the family issues happening. But then it's got to be scary, and I think a lot of them, well, not a lot of them, but like there's the ones that don't work as well can just be a little bit dull, because they're not creative in some way. There isn't that hook, that thing that hooks you in. Yeah,
I think there are probably a lot of filmmakers that just think, oh, this is probably an easy thing to do because it's two people in one house. We'll tie them to a chair, torture them for a bit, you know, and it's like, those are the ones. I think those are the reasons why home invasion has got a bit of a bad rap too, right? Because we probably got quite a lot of those in the 2000s. And also, I found it interesting seeing the polarizing reactions to The Strangers too, because I sort of thought in my head that's sort of one of the most popular home invasion movies, but a lot of people have got in touch and said they find The Strangers quite a boring film too, which is kind of interesting. What are your thoughts on The Strangers, the original The Strangers?
I think the first act of it is like masterful. I think it's horror movie perfection, and then once we sort of get into the chasing and the running and all of that, it's good. but it doesn't hold up. You know, I can start to pick it apart later on, whereas at the beginning I'm so invested and so gripped and so terrified that you can't breathe. And I think that's sustaining the tension in these movies is so difficult. And I know that you'll be talking about Hush eventually, which is one of, I think it's an all-timer for me. You know, what Mike Flanagan does with that is he shifts not genres, but like he'll give you like a new kind of moment just when you think you've figured it out. He'll give you something fresh, and then just when it starts to, if it could potentially get repetitive or boring, he'll flip it into something else. And that can annoy people sometimes, I think, because you don't necessarily stay, oh, I wanted him to keep the mask on, or I wanted it to stay this one type of film, and it shifts. But I think that's a necessity. And if you can shift the film in a way where it keeps the engine revving almost, then you're in for a win.
Incredible, right? And it's been really interesting to see that kind of evolution where you've got these kind of home invasion movies that start off feeling a little bit almost like art house European movies, where you've got like Funny Games and Them from New French Extremity, and then The Strangers kind of made that a little bit more mainstream by, you know, it's American, obviously. You've got Liv Tyler, you've got Masks. Suddenly it feels a little bit more like a classic genre movie. And then the movie we're about to talk about, again, keeping it secret as if it's a secret, You're Next, I feel like takes that one step even further, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I think into being like full-on fun genre movie, you know. So let's get into it. Let's talk. We're going to start off with You're Next from 2011.
I just want you all to know how much it means to us that you're all here.
Thanks to Mom and Dad.
Beautiful.
Just a perfect day.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for Thy food, and help us to do our part with kind words and loving deeds.
Amen.
It gets dark, we go home.
We have a wealthy family that are a family reunion, and they're attacked in their giant secluded mansion by 3 animal-masked, crossbow-wielding, axe-swinging assailants. But to their surprise, it turns out that one of the guests, Erin, is far more capable than anyone could have possibly imagined.
Indeed. So let me start off by asking you, what do you think of this movie, Josh, and what's your kind of history with it?
So this movie's quite interesting, actually. So it came out in 2011, but I don't think it was actually released until 2013, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think it played at a couple of festivals, right?
And then, But 2011 is, it feels like quite an important year in horror for me personally. You know, I was a teenager when Scream came out and introduced me to the genre and made me fall in love with it. But then almost immediately after that sort of like little mini second wave was done, we were into torture porn, and we were into these sort of really glossy, hyper-violent remakes of 70s and 80s movies. We had loads of Japanese remakes. We had all this stuff that just wasn't Scream. And I remember being so disappointed in that, and actually spending a lot of that time revisiting the originals and the classics, and sort of being a little bit of a teenage horror snob and not wanting to see anything that was modern. And then what happened in 2011 is a shift started to happen. You know, we had Scream 4 came out, and for me that was my first time seeing a Scream movie in the cinema. And what I think's interesting is You're Next was a film I was so excited about, and it felt like it's the other side of the same coin to Scream 4, where Scream 4, you know, for better or worse, is wrapping up those glossy remakes of the 2000s in a metatextual way that it's known for. Your Next is doing the same thing, but it's looking forward. You know, it's what we've spoken about a little bit, or you've spoken about in previous episodes, this kind of like mumblecore, mumblegore movement that was happening with things like The House of the Devil with Ty West. You see this film sort of playfully being sort of self-aware, but with a style that feels a bit grimier, a bit more low budget, and with filmmakers that are really in love with the genre rather than trying to get the biggest sort of glossiest CW stars and make a load of money. It's like, it feels like we're back to a sort of almost a grittier way of telling stories, because it has to be, because the money isn't there. They've got to make it on smaller budgets.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. There's a really interesting... You're right. Like, we feel like we're in the dawn of a next kind of era of horror here with this movie, right? Last week, me and Louise talked about The Collector, which is like the most like greeny, grimy 2000s-y new metal Saw-esque kind of torture porn. And this is so different. And it's interesting, you're right. It's like, it's not quite that kind of glossiness of the 90s with CW stars, but it's not the grimness of the 2000s. It's kind of married the two, right? There is a kind of sheen to this movie. It looks a bit visually like a 90s slasher in a way, where you've got the masks and you've got the good-looking stars. But also it's got the nastiness. It's quite a mean, gory film as well, right? And it's a really nice kind of blend of the two here. And I think you're right. Like, we'll talk about this as we go, but it really feels like this is kind of what we're about to get a new decade of in this particular type of movie. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it feels. It just feels like a bit of a love letter. Like, it feels like Adam Wingard. Like, These are films that they want to make, rather than directors, music video directors that are being brought in and sort of told, like, this is the movie. What was it? The year before, we just had the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, which is probably one of the worst examples of that. And then a year later, we're getting this, almost in the way that horror always works in cycles and is always a reaction to the sort of the era that's come before. This feels like a reaction to that. Like, it's fun, but it doesn't shy away from the gore and the horror. But it feels, I don't know, like, it feels a little bit more authentic, or at least where it's coming from feels a little bit more authentic. Yeah, I completely agree. And so what do you think of the film? Generally, you're a fan of it by the sounds of it. Yeah, I'm a big fan. I just remember being really excited about it, reading about it, and it's one that I was so excited to go to the cinema to see. And I hadn't been to the cinema that much before to see horror movies, like fleetingly throughout the decade, sure. But this was like, right, I'm in. And from this movie onwards, the 2010s were like, it was just like banger after banger after banger. And it kind of feels like it somewhat started with this a little bit, or this one was at the very beginning. And I love it. I think it's so much fun. I think, and we can talk about the character of Erin, because I want to talk about Final Girls, and I want to talk about the depiction of violence as well, which I find really interesting in this movie. But it feels like it set the trend, which we've now seen sort of replicated with films like maybe Ready or Not, or even Get Out a little bit, and there's a whole sort of like Eat the Rich angle, which is in this film, but it isn't so ham-fisted as we see in sort of films towards the end of this decade, and even the beginning of this one. So yeah, but to answer your question, I love it. It's really good. It's great, isn't it? And I agree. I hadn't seen this film since whenever it first came out. Maybe it was 2013, whenever it was I first saw it. So it's been about 10 years since I watched it. And it's so great. I think what did strike me, though, is like with the following decade that we've had since being so strong, I do find that like this movie, like you said, it kind of started something that I think maybe now other films have maybe, in my opinion, done better than it, but it did it first, right? So like you said, it feels like this movie kind of walked so that films like Ready or Not could run, right? I feel like Ready or Not, Bodies, like you said, even Get Out, these kind of stick a bunch of kind of quite monstrous but funny rich white people in a big country manor with a cool final girl and watch them all destroy each other, basically, is like, that has become one of the most popular kind of sub-genres of horror, right, over the last few years. And yeah, this movie kind of kicked all that off. And I kind of forgot that. In my head, it was this kind of fun, schlocky, slashery home invasion movie. But I was impressed when rewatching it how much time they take depicting the characters, the performances, the dialogue is funny and witty. And again, there is a kind of Eat the Rich kind of satire in here, although it's not really about that as such, but it's definitely woven in there, isn't it, I think? And I was like, this movie kind of did all this stuff quite a long time before all these other movies that we now talk about, Especially when you think that it was probably being written, in
the height of all these remakes and all this stuff. You always think like this was done even earlier, so the ideas were there sort of brewing. And then I kind of think we've got around that time we had The Cabin in the Woods as well, which is obviously very different, but it's also trying...
Which also had a kind of delayed release.
Yeah, it did. But it's also trying to do its part in shifting the way the genre is at the current time, and like moving it on into like a different direction, which is it is. And I don't think Your Next maybe gets the credit for what it's maybe achieved or accomplished within the genre, but it's just a great it's a great like late night movie to throw on, whether you've seen it before or not. It's got great rewatchability, and I think it's great to watch with people as well.
Yes.
Just because it's one of those ones that you can sort of like yell at the characters and enjoy the deaths and have a laugh while you're watching it.
We talked about what is kind of the best 10-year stretch in horror, right? And there are so many options. I kind of always think in my head that probably around 1973 to 1983 is probably one of the strongest sort of 10 decades in horror. But this is kind of up there too, right? About 2011 to 2021, or 2009 to 2019, or 2018, right? Like that is a strong contender too, I think.
I think it's probably my favorite or my second favorite after the 70s pretty much. And I think it's because it's kind of doing what the 70s was doing. It's just a little bit more creative, I guess, maybe, or I guess within these limitations. I think the way with sort of streaming starting to happen around this time, and Marvel movies taking monopoly at the box office, the way budgets work for movies, it's either like you're this huge like multi-million, like hundreds of millions of dollars movie, or you get one. And I think, movies like Paranormal Activity and the sort of the Blumhouse model has a lot to answer for all of this. But what it did is it forced a lot of directors to be incredibly creative over a short period of time, because they don't have that many days to shoot. Yeah. And you get to see, cool actors come out of the woodwork a little bit. And so, in this we get Barbara Crampton. And for me, who was never really into that particular brand of 80s like sort of B horror movie that she was known for me, I'm sorry to all the listeners, I didn't know who she was when I saw this movie, and this was probably the first movie I'd seen with her. And I remember being like, who's this young woman playing the mother of all of these like really like these old kids? I was like, she's so young to play this character. And then I listened to the audio commentary and sort of researched a little bit more and was like, oh my god, okay, Barbara Crampton, she's a legend. Like and it's cool that you now have the opportunity for these almost iconic actors to get their resurgence, and this is sort of when it started happening as well. Yeah, this was the beginning of the Crampton Renaissance, wasn't it? Really, this was kind of stage one. Yeah, it's so true. And we'll talk about the cast in a minute as we go, but let me start off by asking you about Adam Wingard as a director as well, because obviously we're talking about two of his films today. What do you think of him as a director? How would you describe him as a director, do you think? Well, this and The Guest are like my two faves, and if I'm honest, I haven't really paid attention to a lot of what he's done since, because he's sort of shifted into the mainstream, which is such a shame. Yeah, that in itself is interesting, isn't it? It feels a bit like he started off at the beginning of the decade as this like big new voice in horror, and he's sort of disappeared a bit, hasn't he, since these initial couple of bangers? But so I mean, he's done all the like the Godzilla movies, right? He's done these ones, which I've not really watched. But I think he's very stylish, and you see him improve with each film. Like, even a lot of people didn't like Blair Witch, but I actually thought it was well directed and quite imaginative. And I think, he's very good at adding style to something that's really, really simple. You see it in Your Next, just in the way that the action shot. He's very aware of the genre and what we're expecting, there's just an example would be, when Erin runs to get all of Erin, our final girl in the movie, runs to get all the knives and give everyone a weapon. And then, she gets knocked down, and it goes all slow-mo, and you see all these weapons just falling down, and that's the, you know, maybe we're playing on the whole sort of Laurie Strode Halloween dropping the knife at the end of the film kind of thing, but also we're aware of we're in a period where, you know, Zombieland, Double Tap, like we're all so well versed in what you need to do in this situation, which is you can't just like stab them once in the shoulder and run away. It has to be like pulp their brains into mush, like, and you have that sort of playful moment there, and he's very good at doing that. And I just think his eye for style, which comes way more into The Guest and soundtrack.
His needle drops. He loves a needle drop, right? We literally get it from the opening scene in this movie, right? Someone putting on a tune, and it's like there is like this real kind of fun, like you say, style to his movies. Yeah.
And he's borrowing from The Strangers there. You know, because the use of music in that was really the record in that one moves on to this, and then you see that again like later on in Ready or Not, and that becomes such an integral part of that film. So the sort of big mansion with like a particular song playing on repeat has become a trope that we've seen quite a lot now, but he uses it in this one, and he uses music in The Guest as well in a very similar way, very specific songs. But this is the first film I remember where the sort of John Carpenter synth score came back.
Yes.
And I love the way that it doesn't start that way. It, as Erin's character becomes more empowered or more sort of like, you know, fuck this shit. That's when that music sort of creeps in, and it sort of turns into this 80s synth score that becomes very nostalgically driven. And I like that in this film, that it doesn't start that way, because it shows how transitional a role this film plays in horror, and that it's sort of shifting into that sort of nostalgia as a genre within itself kind of thing.
Yeah, that's such a good point. You're so right, because it's almost like the setup, you think we're rooted in a kind of The Strangers-esque kind of, you know, grisly 2000s style horror film, and then of course it throws us back to the more kind of 80s Carpenter-y kind of stuff. And yeah, you're right. I mean, he's so responsible. Like, you know, I think in my head, and people often probably think this, that that kind of throwback to the 80s that has become so popular through this last decade started with movies like It Follows, maybe. But of course, Adam Wingard had done this twice pre-It Follows, right? With Your Next and The Guest, that kind of synthy, neon-lit, carpentry kind of vibe. He's really responsible for that, isn't he, I think, partly? You know, before things like Stranger Things and whatever kind of became mainstream.
I'm sure there are people that were doing it before. I mean, obviously, Ty West with House of the Devil in 2009. But that feels very like, this is the 80s that actually existed, whereas what Adam Wingard does, more so in The Guest than in Your Next, but like, this is the 80s that we look back through our rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia that then became the entire brand of Stranger Things. So you sort of see that journey there. So I don't know if he was the first. He probably wasn't. There was probably like a million European films that were doing it, and we didn't even notice. But but it's the one that I remember.
No, you're absolutely right about House of the Devil as well. That is doing the same sort of thing. But you're right, in a slightly different way. It's not quite that neon drenched 80s that we now think of as these kind of 80s.
It's the brown
theme.
80s.
It's the browner 80s, exactly that. Yeah. And I really like Adam Wingard as a director as well, and I think you're right. I think like he is so good at style. He's good at these kind of fun poppy synthy throwbacks, and I think what he's less good at for me, and this is the reason why I personally didn't love the Blair Witch film, I think he's less good at tension, scares, more that kind of traditional horror.
Agreed.
You know, The Guest and Your Next are both really fun films, but they're less concerned with actually being kind of, you know, The Strangers-esque kind of scary movies, I suppose. And that's fine. That's not something that he's going for with his films, which is absolutely fine. But I think maybe that was the problem for me with Blair Witch, was that he's so all about that style and the cool visuals. And that's kind of the antithesis to what I want a Blair Witch movie to be. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I wanted it to be a bit more stripped back and terrifying in the way that that movie for me just wasn't, with all of its drones and its witchy night vision and all of that kind of stuff. But,
that's such an interesting point, actually, because I was speaking to you last night on voice note about The Guest specifically, being like, it's just not a horror movie, is it? Like,
right, it's not really, is it?
In the way that we love to look at horror in a really broad sense, of course it is, because it borrows from so many things. But you could even say this about Your Next. Like, there'd be someone out there with a decent argument enough to be like, Your Next isn't even a proper horror movie. You know what I mean? And it's so interesting that because of the way he directs, that actually, like, he tries to make it horror, but he's actually better at doing other things. Because even with Your Next, like, yes, there's gore, yes, there's violence and chases and things like that, but someone could just be like, yeah, it's just a thriller, it's a home invasion thriller. Yeah,
it's almost like a Assault on Precinct 13 or something, right?
Yeah,
Again, with that Carpenter kind of vibe. Absolutely, you're right. I think he's less interested in that stuff, and that's absolutely fine. That's not what he's going for, and it's much more about the action, the style. You know, we'll talk about The Guest, obviously, but that is much more a kind of, I guess, in the same way that Lee Whannell's Upgrade was, right? It's not quite a horror movie, but it's got that kind of ultra-violent cult 80s vibe, right? I think it's the same kind of thing. Yeah.
And I wonder if that's deliberate. I wonder if that's coming from producers maybe going, oh, we can't sell this if it's horror, it's got to be sold as something else, or I don't know, like, because there's always still that backlash sometimes, which is ridiculous, but like, so I don't know if it was that, or whether it's just they are wanting to borrow from so many genres and don't want to get stuck in one particular thing. I don't know, but it's very interesting for sure.
Well, it started off that Adam Wingard said he wanted to make a home invasion movie because he said at the time that home invasion was the one kind of subgenre that still really frightened him. So it's interesting that it started with the seed of that, right? Which leads me to the next question that I think is an interesting thing to discuss with this movie. Is this a home invasion movie or is this a slasher? Is it both? And what's the difference in your brain, do you think?
Oof, that's like, is The Silence of the Lambs a thriller or a horror movie?
Yeah, I know.
I think it walks the line between both. I think it's all just part of the evolution, I guess, of it. So with The Strangers, like you were saying, it takes from sort of New French Extremity a little bit, but it Americanizes it by adding in the sort of the masked killer, which we know is like a famous trope from slasher movies. But it's still pretty much just two characters, and what we know from slasher movies is that for the most part there's a body count. So with Your Next, what we do is we introduce more characters, and we do have a body count, but the body count doesn't feel as perfunctory or repetitive as some of the slashes can be. It's not like a character goes off and then they get
goes off and has sex and then
it doesn't feel like that. It feels like we are living in a post-Scream world, so there is a real clear sense of self-awareness with this movie, but it's not a self-awareness in which the characters are actually talking about movies and things. It just assumes that the audience already knows that, and so with the character of Erin, I think that's what really brings this into modern day slasher territory. Because with Erin, I feel like she's the next step in Final Girls. So if you're looking back at Halloween, you've got, I said before, but Laurie Strode, she's the girl that, like, she fights back, she picks up the knife, but she drops it at the end. And then moving on, we've got Nancy in A Nightmare on Elm Street, who actively is proactive in setting traps to attack Freddy, but there's still a distance there. Like, then we get, obviously, Sydney in Scream, and she's just, you would say, just as smart and proactive as Nancy is, but that the fight with Billy at the end is more intimate, and there's more glee, I would say, from the audience in that fight, you know, pushing a TV on Stu's head. Like, there's a level of thrill and excitement and almost like fist pumping excitement that comes from the violence. And then when we get to Erin here, we're at a point where, well, she's pretty much highly skilled in combat, and you get to a point where we're almost championing her violence, because that's what we've now learnt from movies as what to do. So it's taking that awareness of Scream to the next level. You know, she'll double, triple tap until the job is done, and we're like fist pumping. Which that's now gone even further at the end of that decade with full circle back to Laurie Strode in Halloween, who's got like a secret basement full of guns. Like,
yes.
Because with Erin, she can do it, but she doesn't want to, and it's really heartbreaking, and it doesn't feel like a good thing. It feels closer to like something like, I feel like I'm going off on a huge tangent here, but it feels like it's closer to something like The Hills Have Eyes or The Last House on the Left, which you've spoken about, in which the violence really corrupts.
Yeah.
And it's sort of happening here where she's capable and it's fist bumping and we think it's really exciting, but you see the toll that it has on her. Whereas with Laurie Strode in 2018, it doesn't seem to have that much effect.
Yes.
Like she just does it without thinking. She's ready to kill, and that's okay. And you know, being a murderer effectively is no big deal. And I think that's where we've got to now with violence. So I think You're Next is to wrap it all up, You're Next is a really interesting commentary on sort of where we're at with both the final girl and their relationship to violence through sort of like a modern day audience, I guess. Hope all of that made sense. It just really struck me that when I was watching that this is where she's at.
Absolutely made sense. You're so right about that, because you're right. You know, they start off back with Laurie Strode as these kind of reluctant final girls, almost these girls that don't actually do a hell of a lot. They just have to defend themselves, right? Into these actively being kind of action heroine kind of characters. And I think you're right. And I think the final girl element is what, for me, pushes it more into feeling like a slasher movie than a home invasion movie. You know, you don't have that catharsis in a movie like The Strangers, you know, where Liv Tyler kind of wields a knife and protects herself and wins out, and, you know, everyone fist bumps the air. Like, there is none of that in most home invasion movies. They either manage to survive through luck or they don't, more likely, right? Whereas, this movie, it's really interesting. It's got so many elements. Of course, it is a home invasion in its story. Like, it is about people invading this house. And it happens in real time almost, which is a real trait of home invasion. Like, you're with a bunch of characters in the moment and you're stuck, and that's it until it ends, basically. And that's a very home invasion thing. But you've got a massive body count in this too. You've got about 15, 16 people get killed off. It's like kill after kill. It's fun, it's gory, it's cathartic. And you've got this axe-wielding final girl. All of that kind of it really kind of sits on the line, doesn't it? I think between home invasion and slasher, and I think for so many, that's part of the reason why it's so popular as a home invasion movie. When I ask people online and on the Facebook group, you know, is The Strangers the best home invasion movie? And everyone's like, absolutely not. You're Next is the best home invasion movie. So it's interesting. Like, I think for so many horror fans, at least, this is like such a firm favorite in that subgenre. And I think it's because it's got that, like you said, it's got that rewatchability, it's got that fun, it's got that catharsis, right? It's less of a chore.
It is. It's easy to watch. It makes it easy to watch. And I think that's why I like it so much as well. Like, there are films from before in this subgenre that are objectively better, but I think are harder to watch. And I think there's something to be said for popcorn movies, like to create that almost camaraderie in the audience. I think is something that doesn't get enough credit, really.
Agreed. And actually, I think as well, there's something really interesting here where the tone of the movie is quite over the top and fun. But like you said, the character of Erin and that performance, Shani Vincent, like, she's taking it seriously too, right? This is like, we've talked about this a lot when we talk about Sydney in Scream, right? Like, while all the other characters are quite big and over the top, Sydney plays everything dead straight. And I think it's the same here. Like you said, that Erin isn't actually having a fun time in this movie, even compared to cut to 10 years later with Samara Weaving and Ready or Not. There's much more of a comedic performance there.
Yes.
Whereas, Erin she's not enjoying what she's going through, right? Like, the performances take this movie seriously too, I think, which is fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's intentional. She's meant to be the outsider, and the outsider that we're rooting for, which is nice. I love that they cast Shani Vincent, who's Australian, and so like even just her accent stands out.
Yes.
But she's incredibly capable, and that's where the fun comes from in the movie. And it's where, you know, it's that classic sort of turning the tables, but it takes that to the next level. And that's what makes it so fun. But then what's interesting is the ending. All of the violence that she's inflicted throughout the entire film has been defensive to a degree. Like, she's not actively killing for sport almost, or it's not maybe emotionally driven. It's not vengeful until she kills AJ Bowen at the end. Like, she gets the choice not to, and she stabs him in the head, and that's the moment that she gets shot.
Yes, she's punished.
Almost like she's punished for it, which I find really interesting. Like, you know, if she hadn't done that, maybe things would have ended up differently if that cop was just, you know, right outside. So I find that really fascinating as well, that like there's a level of just ever so slightly the film maybe condemning the violence, even though it's super fun, which I think is something that we've lost as time's gone on, because people see this movie and go, oh my god, so fun, let's have like the badass final girl character, but they don't see that actually, even though this is silly and over the top, like the fact that she's played a little bit straighter and dare I say it, there's a little bit more nuance, I think,
definitely
in it when you sort of pick beneath the surface.
Yeah, completely agree. Let's talk about these other performances then, because it's such a big ensemble cast, and we've touched upon this already. I don't think it was something I necessarily appreciated when I watched it back in the day, but like you said, that it feels like everyone in this film is part of this kind of horror community of filmmakers, actors, right? You've got Ty West, you've got Barbara Crampton, you've got other kind of filmmakers like AJ Bowen and Joe Swanberg, right? What do you think of this cast and these performances?
It's cool. It feels like you would get this rotation of these familiar faces popping up. Yeah. And again, just for me, what I like about it is it feels attainable. You know, you don't have to be this big star to be in a movie anymore, and it feels like it's almost circling back to the 80s and those early slashers where like it'll be a bunch of sort of no names, and it's the movie itself that makes them the names, you know, because horror fans are so loving, they'll be like, oh yes, Man 4 in 7th sequel to blah 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 blah, you're my favorite person in the world. Like, we do that. And so seeing this just as an actor was like, oh, this is brilliant, this is possible. You know, you don't have to be the star of a CW show or be, you know, huge in Hollywood to be able to make movies. And so I love it. I love seeing it. You know, Ty West's little cameo as Tariq is really fun.
So funny.
I think even Simon Barrett, doesn't he play, so Simon Barrett's the writer, he plays one of the masked villains in it as well. So it's cool. It feels like summer camp almost. Everyone sort of came together and just did their little bit.
And like you said, you mentioned it already, and I know that I talked about this with Alex a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Creep, but that kind of mumblecore, mumblegore era of horror here as well, right? These are all... These people feel very much part of that movement, don't they? Particularly AJ Bowen, like these kind of... and I think there is something that feels almost improvised to the dialogue and the script here as well, right? Which really helps. There's something very naturalistic about it. Even though it's such a heightened film, it's a weird mix, isn't it, I think?
It is, but it doesn't feel like we've got... Like, it was interesting listening to your episode on Hard Candy, and a lot of Elliot Page's dialogue is still very much of that sort of Diablo Cody, Kevin Williamson, hyper-articulate, scripted, specific, you know, borderline insufferable, but really kind of cool as well. This couldn't be further from that. This is just folks kind of chatting about nothing for quite a while. And again, there's a fine balance to be done with that, because you still have to tell a story, you do have to set up characters, but you have to do it in a way where it feels effortless, and I think they do it pretty well in this one. You know, the dinner table scene is so fantastic that's sort of like the emotional culmination of all these microaggressions and tensions that have been happening throughout the first act, which then gets completely like undercut by the first attack and the first kill happening. I think it's really well done.
Yeah, I love that too. And this is something I've talked about a lot, of course, but I love any horror movie with an awkward dinner party as the kind of centerpiece. And we are about to get an entire decade of those types of movies. And again, this is an early example of that, I think. That kind of awkward social dynamics play out, and then it turns into real horror.
So Tariq, what do you do?
I'm a filmmaker.
Is that right?
Oh, wow.
That's right.
Yeah, he's really good.
I don't think I know any filmmakers. That is
exotic.
There's not a lot of us out there.
Interesting.
Well, I've only made...
TV?
I'm not on TV. I've only made one documentary. It was at the Cleveland Underground Film Festival, 2008.
What is an underground film festival? Do they show the movies underground?
No. They show them above ground, but
It's really intellectual. They show intellectual.
Like an intellectual film festival. I just think, do you do commercials? Because those are my favorite.
No.
No,
he doesn't do commercials.
Really?
Why
I
not?
just think that is just the height of the art form these days. It is just short and punchy. You really got to just zing the ideas on in there.
That's why I watch
just think
TV
it's so-
these days.
That's why I mean, it's better than the shows now.
Well, he makes documentaries, so...
it's different.
Yeah, but I think that I've seen documentary commercials. I don't think they have to be limited to any particular thing. It's not the starving
Not black and
artist thing
white.
just never
We're
made
not
sense to me.
No.
I just think you should consider it, Tyree.
Sure.
What do you think of this family? I mean, do you think that Adam Wingard is going for a kind of social satire or social commentary in the way that movies, going forward, like Get Out and Ready or Not, end up doing more overtly? Is that kind of part of this? Because there are these kind of almost grotesque rich white characters in this family, right?
I think possibly, but I also think it's leaning into the idea of having a bunch of characters that we want to see get killed. And I think it's playing into that a little bit. And I think it's just a smart move in a storytelling point of view as well, because it gives character to what can be the classic slow, boring act one. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so if we can add humor and character, it feels like a no-brainer. Like, we're in this big mansion. Okay, who has big mansions? Rich people. Okay, cool. What if they all hate each other? That could be fun. Like, it feels very simple. It doesn't feel as pointed as movies that have almost been inspired by this do. But it might well be a class critique. I think we can definitely read it that way for sure. But I think also it's just a lot of fun. I think it's just quite entertaining, and it sets Erin's character apart as well as being sort of more grounded. And by making all the other characters completely incapable, it shows that she is far more capable, and it gets us on her side. So I think it works in both those ways.
And I think also the thing that sets it apart from movies like The Strangers is that the killers in this actually have a motive, right? And I think that in some ways makes it less scary. It's not just because you are home. There is a reason. There's a whole plot involving kind of inheritance money and that kind of thing. And actually that goes all the way back to the heyday of kind of the Agatha Christie murder mysteries. We talked about movies from back in the day like The Cat and the Canary, and then there were Nun, movies like that. I think some of that plays into this, and we do see a resurgence of these types of movies too, and the way that they link with home invasion in this decade. Ready or Not, Bodies, even Knives Out, right? These movies that do contain this kind of murder plot, but also contain this kind of class critique, which is really fun. And of course, this movie loves to poke fun at cinema too, right? There's that brilliant conversation around the dinner table where they talk about the underground film festival and everything.
You know what? I love commercials. I think they're the best. They're quick, they're zippy. Like, it's really funny. So good.
Yeah. And Barbara Crampton, again, actually similar to Shani Vincent, Barbara Crampton is playing this dead straight too, isn't she? Like when the shit hits the fan and she watches her daughter die, like she's genuinely playing it like a mother that's just watched her daughter die, right?
And what I love, we were talking about how it's a bit of a thankless role for her, and I think it is.
Yes.
But she doesn't underplay any of it. Like
she owns it.
She owns it. And what I love and what I think is so fitting and perfect for her character is that, clearly there are people in the house. But the way she knows how to cope with a very stressful situation is just to go to bed. She goes to bed and has a cry. Like, I've never really seen that in a horror movie.
No, can you imagine? Like,
just
final
like,
act of Scream, Sydney just has to go and have a nap in the
has
middle
a cry,
of
like in bed. What are you doing? Really makes me laugh.
Incredible. That is where the movie is really kind of having fun and a little like wink, I think, isn't it? Because it's like, absolutely, that would not happen. But again, Barbara Crampton really sells it. Like she really is going for it.
She's great. I'm far too young to have that many kids of that age, but
absolutely. So the shit hits the fan pretty soon. The arrows start coming in through the window. What do you think of the killer? What do you make of the masks? Obviously, masks are so important in these sorts of movies. The Strangers, I think that's partly what made The Strangers so iconic, right? And so scary. Those masks are fucking creepy. Hush is creepy because of the mask as well. What do you think of these kind of like animal masks and these killers?
I think they're really good. I think they're really effective, and it's. I'm always so impressed with how creative people can be, because when you think like, well, you can't do any better than like Michael, Freddy, Jason, really,
right?
And then you get Ghostface. You're like, oh, wow, okay, cool. Find one more, and then you get these, which they're not as iconic, but with The Strangers and with You're Next, you're like, no, these are really effective within the movie. And what I think works is it feels realistic as well.
Yeah.
It's not just dudes in balaclavas. They've got masks, but they can come off and on easily enough, so it feels like these are like, trained military guys that are trying to earn some money.
Exactly.
Like, it feels.
Yes.
It doesn't feel like a movie. It feels like, no, these guys had put these masks on and.
I think that's the other thing that makes it feel a bit more home invasion-y than slashery, is that it's not like these killers are these Michael Myers-esque. They're not human. They're the Shape. They're like, it's nothing like that. Like, they are just a bunch of dudes, right? That are that are getting a job done, basically, right?
With their AirPods in,
exactly.
Listen to some tunes. It's just another job.
What do you think of the arrows too? Because again, that's quite unusual, isn't it? And I think that's again what maybe, in a weird way, kind of slightly removes it from feeling like a scary horror movie, because it's not a kitchen knife. It's not I don't know. There's something about bow and arrows that makes it feel a bit more like a kind of action movie or siege movie or something, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, it does. But also it makes it, I think, not necessarily scarier, but I think real in the sense of like, well, why are you coming at wow, can't say words. Why are you coming at someone with a kitchen knife when you could just have a gun?
Yes.
And I think this is that. So there's a level of fun because it's not a gun. Guns are very boring. They're the thing that wrap up the movie at the end.
Yeah.
We get that sort of, oh shit, like, you can run away from a knife, but what about an arrow? And it makes the violence feel more like, it makes it harder. Feels like it's harder to escape.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think there is again this feeling of what's different to in The Strangers. Clearly, it's just like, they don't just want to kill them, they actively are just messing with them and trying to terrify them. Whereas with this movie, it's like, no, they're just trying to get the job done, which is just kill who they need to kill, right? As well, there's a bit less, weirdly, there is a bit less of the kind of sadism, I guess, of The Strangers. And it's a bit more like, right, we just need to get rid of these people, essentially. Right?
Yes, though they do love writing "You're next" in blood on the walls. Just,
That's true. That's true. Love their little messages. They do, yeah. And then, how do you find it? The gore, the kills, that big middle chunk of the movie, which is just like pure carnage, all in one location. How do you find that and the way it's directed? Does the movie kind of keep up that momentum and pacing for you throughout once the shit hits the fan?
Yeah, I think it does. I do remember I can be very particular and very nitpicky with horror action. I think we all can. If you love slasher movies and you like a chase scene, you're going to be really particular with what you like, and it's the nerd in me jumping out. And I remember watching it being like, that's a bit annoying and that's a bit annoying, but actually as you just let all that shit go and you kind of watch it and enjoy it, I think it's really fun and really effective, especially when you know things are coming. I mean, the sort of the wire across the door is brilliant.
Love that. The running to the door and getting her throat cut,
because it's so dumb. Fun. It's so dumb, but so entertaining and gross as well. Like, it gives you all those things. So I think it does really well. It doesn't let up. I think we talk about geography a lot. I know you spoke about that with Joe and Trace on the Strangers episode, that geography is so important in these movies, and I think it does really well with that, with the windows and the doors and sort of knowing who's climbing through what and where everything is. I think they make really good use of the set and all of the things in it. So I think the action's really, really good.
And the house itself, right? I mean, obviously, like, practically, it's always great to focus in on a rich family and a big house because you have more to play with, right? The house is absolutely fucking massive in this film, which again gives the filmmakers carte blanche, right? To just like, we can run around from room to room, basement, whatever. It kind of almost feels endless, like places to hide and places to run, which is very cool.
And they don't give you too many, I mean, they probably couldn't, but they don't give you too many new locations within it that you're like, where are we now? You kind of, it makes use of the spaces that they have, and it feels like realistic in that sense of like them going out then coming back in. And I love the nails in the wood by the windows and things like that. It's that Elm Street setting of the traps. I mean, you get the axe in front of the door, which is very Nancy Thompson with the sledgehammer.
It's very Wes Craven.
It is,
so funny.
And you can see those elements you would never think would be in the film from the beginning, when you have this sort of like grimy sex scene turned, quite a grisly kill in the beginning. And it looks a bit cheap and a little bit gritty. And then by the end of the film, we're in like high octane 80s synths, axes swinging from doorways, traps being set. And so it's cool that it has that sort of trajectory as the film progresses.
So true. Erin obviously like is immediately amazing as soon as shit starts hitting the fan, right? And this whole family are like, how the fuck does she know so much about this, right? It's so funny. What is it again, her backstory, that she grew up in like a commune, a survivalist commune or something like that?
I think her dad raised her in a survivalist commune, so she's trained for survival, effectively. I'm into survival. She's trained, in that regard. And what I think makes it even funnier, and what's quite a nice twist in this movie, is that most of the killers, shall we say, there's a reveal that happens midway through. And so then you've got them interacting with her where we know they're bad. She doesn't know they are. And they're getting increasingly more pissed off at how capable she is and how many good ideas she's having, because it's just foiling their plan.
So fun. Let's talk about that. How do you find that twist, right? So it's first of all revealed that it's Felix and Z, right, are the two that have hired the assassins in the masks to kill the family so they can get inheritance money, basically, right? That's the kind of main sort of reveal. There's some really funny scenes. I love it when Z is like, let's fuck on this bed next to your dead mother. It's so good. How do you find these two?
I think they're great. I think Z is a really fun character because similarly to Erin, she is very much an outsider. She's sort of like this edgy, alternative, almost goth character that just gives... She's so desensitized and gives absolutely zero shit. She's sort of just there for the ride. And then you've got her boyfriend Felix, who is so pathetic. Like when he kills his brother, he's talking about how hard it is for him to do this and how he doesn't want to be doing it. He's just really whiny. And there's a great moment as well, actually, where I think some of the exposition, and so there's a moment where he talks about, they must be using a cell phone blocker and all of that, which it's so like finger pointy at him. It's like, that's such specific information to throw out in the middle of like arrows being thrown through, shot through a window. But what makes it work is his brother Drake's reaction to it, which is like, you're such a fucking shit. Like, why do you know this shit? Like, and so it uses humor as a way of offsetting any sort of like suspicion. Because I never, when I first watched it, thought that was going to happen.
No. Agreed.
And then you get the ultimate twist at the end that actually Erin's boyfriend, played by AJ Bowen, Crispin, is in it as well, but he's the most pathetic of them all because he's just dipped from the entire situation because he just can't handle blood and violence and things like that.
That again really makes the film feel ahead of its time, right? I don't know, there's something about that feels very now, this idea of all of these kind of toxic men, and none of them are let off the hook. None of them are the nice guy in this situation, right? And I love that reveal that AJ Bowen's character turns out to be maybe the worst out of all of them in a way, right? Because he's so unbelievably pathetic and whiny, and it's a real applaud moment, isn't it, when she kills him in that really violent way at the end,
Perfect. It is. But then, like we said before, gets immediately offset with her getting shot as well. So like the moment she takes actual vengeance on someone in the same way that this family are doing, she gets shot. And I think that's a really important thing that the film keeps in. Yeah. Because it could very easily just end with her, you know, stabbing him and then like walking out the house.
Absolutely.
You know, lighting up a cigarette. Like, but it doesn't. And although I'm grateful that she's alive at the end, because I like, you know, even if they're like battered and bruised and bloody, like I like a survivor. Yeah. It's not without cost. And I think that cost comes from her sort of, you know, enacting vengeance on her boyfriend.
Yeah, you're so right about that. You're right. It's a very deliberate choice, right, that they choose to shoot her at that moment. It's a really fun like little sting in its tail at the end of the movie. And then, of course, we get that fun axe swinging down onto the cop. Perfect. So much fun. Do you think this movie ever should have had a sequel? Like, are you surprised that this movie didn't become any kind of franchise?
Oh, I'm glad it hasn't.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I think there's something special about this era of horror where you do get a lot of one-offs. Yeah. You know, It Follows hasn't, The Guest hasn't. And I'm happy about that, because what's nice is it almost feels like they're sort of sequels anyway. Like, you know, in the fact that you've got this rotating group of cast members and directors and creatives, it's like, oh, no, they're just... That's what you come for. You come for the people and the writers and the directors, and then they give you a little something different. It's like having like a decade of anthology movies rather than specific sequels.
I love that. Yeah, you're so right. It's almost like a kind of Blumhousey prototype almost that they've got going on, right? I completely agree. And yeah, I think it does. It makes this movie a little bit more special. It's also maybe the reason why this movie isn't acknowledged by as many people, and why Erin isn't acknowledged as a great final girl maybe as much as she should be, I think, which is a shame, but that's just the nature of it, right? When you turn something into a franchise, then suddenly it becomes much more of a widely known thing, as we're going to see with The Strangers, I'm sure, next year, right?
Which I'm excited about. I will be there first night.
Absolutely. Can't wait. We're getting all three in the same year, right?
I think so, yeah, something like that. But fair enough. Like, I think if they're doing a kind of Fear Street thing, I think that's great.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So there you go. That's your next. And my final question usually is, how do you think it kind of holds up on rewatch? But sounds like it holds up well for you by the sounds of it.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I'm quite funny with the way that I review films. Like, this for so long has been like a 3.5 stars out of 5 on Letterboxd for me. Yeah. I bumped it up on this rewatch to 4 because I think I love it so much. It's about time. I think I can look at films in a way where it's like, yeah, objectively, like it's this one thing, but then for me personally, it's something else. And I think for me personally, I love it. I've watched it so many times. It holds a really important spot in my sort of journey as a horror fan. But then sort of big picture, you know, you're going to look at other movies that are probably better made and do different things. But actually, having spoken about it, it's within its specific subgenre, you can sort of see how it's actually been more influential and more beloved than I think maybe we anticipated.
I think you're right. Absolutely. I think I like this film a lot. For me, it is a good, solid, like 3.5 star movie as well. I think it's really fun. I think it's more fun when you watch it with an audience, like you said, for sure, when you watch it in a group. But absolutely, I think for a movie that is probably not that well known outside of the horror community, within the horror community, it's so beloved. Like, it is, like, people absolutely do like kind of name it as one of their faves of the decade, fave home invasion movie. And I think you can see that influence on horror filmmakers for sure. Yeah, it's like a really interesting kind of low-key milestone in horror, right? Which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Before we get into the second half of this week's episode, just taking a minute to thank this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber, Joseph Donahue. A big thank you to Joseph for supporting the evolution of horror. Joseph sent me a little message, which I'm going to read out now. He says, hello to all my fellow boys and ghouls. This is J. Michael Donahue here to tell you that my comic book, Morsels, is now back for a second helping on Kickstarter with Morsels, the main course. This collection offers offers 3 meatier, scarier tales that will have you screaming until you pop. A variety of tiers give the option to pick between 3 terrifying covers, a variety of swag, the opportunity to gorge yourself on a smorgasbord of goodies, and even the chance to have yourself drawn into the book. Just head to kickstarter.com/morsels the main course, or go to kickstarter.com and search Morsels the main course. But don't delay, the campaign returns to the grave on October 5th. Thank you so much, Joseph. That sounds awesome. So for any fans out there listening of horror comic books, please go and back Joseph's new project, Morsels the Main Course. I'll read that URL one more time. It's kickstarter.com/morsels-the-main-course. One more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber, Joseph Donahue. And don't forget, if you want to become an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, get your own dedicated little segment on an episode just like this one, then sign up to our Patreon channel at a $20 level. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode as Joshua Tonks and I discuss the next Adam Wingard banger from 2014. It's The Guest.
Can I help you?
Mrs. Peterson?
Yes?
My name is David. Mrs. Peterson, I knew your son, Caleb. I was with him when he died. That's me.
You know Caleb?
Yes, ma'am. We were pretty close.
Yes, ma'am.
He wanted me to tell you that he loved you.
Thanks.
He asked me to check on y'all. And so, we're gonna be good friends.
Okay, The Guest. So in the days leading up to Halloween, the Peterson family, still grieving the loss of their eldest son Caleb to the war in Afghanistan, are visited by David Collins, a former army sergeant who claims to be their son's best friend. Invited to stay as their guest, David begins helping the family, providing emotional support for Caleb's parents, while advising teenage son Luke on how to deal with his bullies. But things take a turn when the suspicious daughter, Anna, played by the iconic Micah Monroe,
Yes.
begins investigating David's history and discovers that, everything is not as it seems.
Yes. Yes, indeed. So what do you think of this movie? How does it compare for you to his previous feature, You're Next?
I think it's the next step up.
Yeah.
I think it's ever so slightly better. I think it's better made. I think it's so fucking cool. This movie is so cool.
Yeah.
And I love it. I was so excited about this one as well, specifically because it was the combination of Adam Wingard and Simon Barrett, and they'd done You're Next. And I think, around this time, It Follows was happening as well. And so, Micah Monroe, I was really excited about seeing. Because it felt like that Sarah Michelle Gellar thing of like that double whammy of Scream 2 and I Know What You Did Last Summer. It's like that perfect sort of like double pairing of movies, and that's what I sort of view these two as. They're like a great pair, even though they're very different. And then Dan Stevens as well, coming right off the back of Downton Abbey.
Yeah, weird choice. Amazing, right?
I was thinking about this last night when I was watching it. This might be the role that he's going to be most remembered for.
Yeah.
Obviously Downton for sure, but like I said before, the way that horror fans will love and adore anyone in horror, I think he's going to have fans for the rest of his life, specifically because of this film.
Yeah.
And I think his performance is fantastic,
Yeah, I really loved this film as well, actually. And you're right, I do pair it in my head with It Follows. I remember at the time seeing them quite relatively close together. Both obviously these very stylized 80s throwbacks, but sort of slightly otherworldly 80s, and both starring Micah Monroe, right, as well. They're very easy to kind of pair up in your head, I think. And yeah, I think you're right. I think this movie is a step up technically from what he did with You're Next. I think it slightly crossed over into the mainstream more as well. I think a lot more people know about this movie.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've put this in a home invasion series on a horror podcast. I don't quite know if it's either of those things, a horror movie or a home invasion movie, but I think there are some really interesting comparisons. I was thinking about this when watching it last night. To me, there's almost an element of the kind of erotic thriller to this movie. There's something quite sexy about it, and it's almost like a flip side to the kind of, I don't know, the kind of the hand that rocks the cradle. This person infiltrates this family's home who may not be as trustworthy as they think kind of vibe, right? There's a lot of, movies like that from the early 90s, late 80s. The Crush, they're almost like Fatal Attraction almost. Or, all of those kind of movies. Feels like this sort of belongs in that kind of school, doesn't it, in a weird way? But it's doing something stylistically very different, but narratively, I think there's something kind of interesting about this movie, isn't there? It's a kind of soft home invasion.
It never fully goes there.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the strongest assets to the film, and what gives it the not respectability, like maybe respectability, like that gives it like the it's not a classy movie,
no,
but it doesn't ever descend into what it could. It doesn't become full exploitation. It doesn't. No. It's like a porn setup, but it doesn't ever do that. Like,
yes.
And it's so sexy, and it sort of sizzles with this like eroticism underneath it. Like, you just want Dan Stevens and Michael Monroe to fuck the whole movie, and they don't. And I'm glad that they don't, because it gives you something so much more. But it almost puts you into this place of like, you want it to happen. And it almost feels like this type of character, we've probably seen it a million times before, but for me it was one of the first examples of it that we now see with Penn Badgley and You, which is that devastatingly sexy character that is bad.
Yes.
This is a bad person, but like, when can I stop being attracted to him? When's that line? When does that happen? You know what I mean? Like, you're like, you just want him to get away with it the whole time, even though he's like killing family members and like just doing all these horrible things.
There's a really interesting kind of blurry area in this, isn't there too, where like, You is a good example. Dexter is another great example of this, right? These kind of sociopaths that are sort of killing the people they should be killing, at least initially, right? Like, I don't know, there's something about him initially where you're like, oh, he's almost like this Mary Poppins type character who's going to come into this family and turn their lives around and improve this family's life, right? It's a kind of weird, sordid subversion of that narrative initially,
but in all the worst ways possible.
Yes, it's so good. It's like, he's going to help the kids stand up to the bullies, and he's going to help the dad with his job promotion, and this kind of struggling family who are going through something very sad too, and you want to root for them, and you sort of want to root for him initially, and then you're like, oh no, he's a complete wrong-un. That's right.
I absolutely love that take. In my head, it's always been, well, this is it's of course the Terminator meets Halloween. That's exactly what it is. But the fact that it's the Terminator meets Halloween meets Mary Poppins, stunning work.
Yes, they could have all just done with flying a kite at the end. I think that's what they needed ultimately. And this movie does love Dan Stevens. There is a very female gaze or a kind of queer eye to this movie, right? It feels like it's really interesting.
Queer eye on the straight guy,
like that. Again, like, you don't get that. Adam Wingard didn't give us that with You're Next, right? But he's really going for something specifically in this movie, isn't he? It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think whether there was a commentary or I watched an interview or something, but I remember him specific. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the shower scene. Let's talk about that moment.
Josh has been waiting for this.
I've been waiting my whole life. But it's so specific and it's so deliberate. We have this moment of him coming out of a steamy shower with just the towel on, and it surprises Michael Monroe's character, and there's that like sizzling tension between them. Will they, won't they, what's going to happen? I remember listening to an interview where Adam Wingard said it was specific for the trailer because they knew the actor that they had. They knew that he was such a heartthrob from Downton Abbey, and to depict him in this way would help sell the movie. So it's really deliberate. It fucking works as well. It's so good. But it's so funny because it's just that. Like, he's not naked, he's just in a towel. So it's that kind of like safe sexuality as well that I think sometimes can work a little bit better and is more palatable than it going like full on.
Yeah, you're right.
You know,
Yeah.
nudity and all of that. Like, and it makes it a little bit more mainstream.
Yes.
You know, so you're you know, someone's mum or grandma could watch it and be like, oh, he's a bit all right. You know, it's in that voice, he's a bit all right. Because that's how mums and grandmas
That's how most
speak.
grandmas sound. Yeah, I love it.
Traditionally. But I think because Downton was such a mainstream show, they had to give a little bit of that to really sort of sell. And I it's great.
Yeah, and you're right with what you said about how you kind of want the two of them to fuck, but they don't, right? Throughout the whole movie. He has sex with the friend, doesn't he, at one point?
He does, yeah.
But other than that, it's actually quite a chaste movie, isn't it? Like, there's not a whole lot of, like you say, exploitation or anything explicit there. But it's just like sizzling throughout, isn't it? So good.
Because it has an edge of exploitation to it as well. It has an edge of trash to it.
Oh, yeah.
Completely. And like, its plot is absurd, really, when you break it down.
It's like a pulp novel or a late
Pulpy,
night movie.
that's the perfect word.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so what do you think of the way he directs this? We've talked about it briefly already, but the fact that he's really going for this sort of 80s cult movie aesthetic and vibe. Obviously, the soundtrack has become so iconic for this movie too. And like, yeah, how do you find just the way this movie generally looks and sounds, I guess?
I think if it didn't look and sound the way it does, it could run the risk of being a little bit dull. And that's not to say that it's style over substance, because I think the performances are fantastic as well, but it's what makes it. And what I love, and Your Next has this as well, you can tell a movie is like, has hit it right within its audience when there are so many fan posters. There's so much fan art of this movie, and it's just begging for it, you know. There isn't even that much neon or anything or bisexual lighting in this movie, but the posters and the marketing and that final act have just solidified this sort of, and the soundtrack, I guess, as well, have like solidified this sort of very clear aesthetic that this movie has. And when I think of it, that's what I think about first. I think the fashion is incredible. Like, you know, everything that Michael Monroe wears, from her sort of blue and yellow waitress uniform, which feels like a Halloween costume in the making, like, but then even like her sort of skull aesthetic that she wears. She's got like a skull scarf, and she's got this sort of like little tight mini dress thing that's got like a skull on it as well, like, and these really like high knee socks that she wears, like, it feels really iconic, like, instantly. And then even with, you know, Dan Stevens, it's like Ryan Gosling in Drive. It's got a real, I think, influence from Drive, I think, in his sort of somewhat stoic main character. But even him just in a hoodie feels really like stylish, you know what I mean? Like, minimal but really stylish. And I think that all works in the film's favor. And then, of course, the soundtrack and the songs that get used specifically, you know, we get a mix CD made in this movie, which feels so retro as well. So yeah, I think all of that, you know, makes the film work. And I think in lesser hands, this film could be dull as shit.
I agree. I completely agree with you. It's so much about that. And actually, of course, Drive, like you mentioned, Drive, that's another hugely important movie in this kind of wave of synthy neon 80s throwbacks, right? That's 2011. That's another movie. I mean, I love the movie, but I do think that if you took away that soundtrack, Drive would not be as popular or as interesting as it was, right? Or as iconic as it was. And I think, you're absolutely right. It's the same with this, is that incredible look that, you know, I got one of those TVs with the lights that shine the different colours, and my living room was just glowing like pink and green and blue during that party scene and during the final act. You know, it's those amazing colours, those amazing synthy vibes. And again, this is what I really think of when I think of how horror changed from the 2000s into the 2010s, right? It did become a little bit camper in a way. Like there's an element of camp to this movie too, I think, that I love.
Yeah,
you know?
When you said that, I'd like never thought of that before with this one, and I was like, is it?
Well, low-key, not camp like Rocky Horror, obviously, but like something. There's something.
But no, I agree, and I think that's what the film does so well, is that it like gives you these hints of like a little bit of everything, but never quite fully goes into it. But with the whole camp thing, I was like, okay, is it? And then I think it comes from Dan Stevens' performance, because it, in the way that Ryan Gosling in Drive, you know, he's just sex on a stick the whole movie, but he's charming and sweet, and it's an amazing performance, but there's maybe he's a little humorless in comparison to Dan Stevens in this, and there's a bit of glee that happens behind the eyes.
There's a twinkle, isn't there? There's
a twinkle here, and like there's a level of fun to it, and I think that's where that comes from, because him going from I'm going to kill you to no, I'm fine, like this sort of almost like Stepford dude. That's where I think the sort of borderline camp can kind of creep in. It's definitely in his performance.
And there is also the movie is about that kind of masculinity too, right? You know, everything from like him riling up the bullies by buying them Cosmopolitans to...
Yes. There's the dad being like this sort of like very sort of... Is it beta? Is that how you say
right,
it?
Yeah. Yeah, you're
like
right.
Alphabet. I'm like, is that? I don't know all my Greek letters.
Right.
So.
And there's actually actually a kind of story point about, you know, the use of the kind of the homophobic slur, and that's a kind of trigger for a big major scene later on in the film as well, and everything. So I think there is a kind of exploration of that masculinity, isn't there, in this movie?
Which with the slur specifically, I actually quite liked that, because so many 80s movies use that word just off the cuff. I love that it became I love that it became a key plot point, and was specifically flipped to become empowering for the character that it was used against, and I thought that was really cool, actually.
A gay student targeted with physical violence finally defends himself, and you're what? Suspending him?
We could consider suspension.
No, you couldn't. I'll be interested to see what the board makes of you when this is in front of the entire country, not to mention our lawyers. Do you want to sue them?
I don't,
We're suing you and the school board.
I didn't even know he was gay. What about after-school detention?
For how long?
A month.
That seems fair.
I like that we're in an era, and have been for quite a while now, where it's... Jessica Lange said it best in American Horror Story Coven, where she's like, there's nothing I hate more than a racist, which is the fact, and it's just that idea that you can be the most deplorable, awful, murderous character, but you're not racist, homophobic, or anything. Like, you know what I mean? I just think I quite like that era that we're in.
100%. That is so much the era that we're in now. You know, Chucky saying, I'm not a monster.
Yeah, exactly.
It's that, isn't it? You know,
just
and
funny.
You're right. Even a few years earlier, like me and Louise literally last week talked about in The Collector, there's quite an excessive use of that slur just from the main hero. He just spouts it. And like that even in the you say the 80s, even the 2000s, it was riddled with that kind of like hateful stuff, right?
Oh yeah, I forget actually, like the 2000s, you think... When we were in the 2000s, I was like, oh, we're so progressive. And then you look back at the 2000s, you're like, it's the fucking dark ages.
It was the dark ages. It was such a mean time.
Kelly Rowland in Freddy vs. Jason calling Freddy Krueger an F word is so fucking funny now to me.
It's
like,
so
that's camp.
Weird.
That is camp.
That is camp. You're right. You're
hilarious.
right. Whereas
anyway.
now it's used for a reason in this movie,
yes.
right? You know, for better or worse. And this movie isn't doing anything profound or, you know, anything socially progressive. It's being a silly genre film, but I think you can see the difference already, right?
I quite
the way
enjoyed
that the characters behave. And what do you think of our family? You know, we talked about this kind of slightly grotesque rich family in their mansion in You're Next. What do you think of this family in comparison? Obviously, it's quite different, right?
Yeah, it's a nice flip, isn't it? You know, they live in a really small, fairly humble home, sort of out in the desert, it seems. You know, dad's struggling to become the manager at work. I think mum is, you know, very much grieving the loss of her son.
Yeah.
You've got Micah Monroe's Anna. She is, you know, working in the restaurant.
Yeah.
Like a little diner. And then you've got the little, the younger brother, Luke, who's getting bullied at school. So they've all got these problems, and they're all seemingly from a more sort of humble, less wealthy background. And I like that. I like that we get the flip on that, and there's no real judgment to it either. But we feel like, especially with the sort of army, Afghanistan of it all as well, sort of underneath it, you feel this sort of like a little bit more working class,
absolutely,
element to the film.
A working class, but it's not. The movie doesn't judge them either. It's not like a very patronising look at a struggling family in that way, right? They're not kind of like white trash, quote unquote, or anything like that, which is kind of interesting. And Micah Monroe, you know, like you talked about this earlier, but she sort of felt like she instantly became a bit of a horror icon between this and It Follows, right? And she's done cool stuff since then. But what do you think it is about her as a performer? Like, is it something to do with her acting style or her look that particularly suits these kinds of movies too? These kind of like 80s throwbacks or something? I don't know.
She's just quite cool and effortless, and I think the 1-2 punch of this and It Follows, you know, in which, like, you know, not to undermine her performance, because she's doing a great job in both of them.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't say that her performance is what sells those movies.
No, no.
And if anything, you know, the fact that she, you know, sort of blends into the style so well is probably a real skill that she has to be able to manage. But she's just really cool. She's really understated. She hits the emotion without, like, it just all feels very effortless for her.
It does.
I think that's probably why. And she just cool. I've said it 50 times. She's just cool.
There's something about her that like, I don't know. She's a brilliant actress. She might be great at doing everything, but I find it harder to imagine her in like a naturalistic drama or something. Like, there is something slightly heightened about the way she behaves in these movies, and maybe that's because of the films themselves and the way she's directed, right? But I think there's something kind of cool and, I don't know, film starry about her. Is the only way I can think to describe it, you know? But
in an edgy sort of like B-list way, like B-movie way. You
exactly.
know, I think she's beautiful but somewhat unconventional as well, like from what we know from, you know, traditional beauty. And, you know, actually if you compare, not to like, oh God, dare I compare how women look, but like if you were to compare the type of actresses that were cast in, you know, all those movies of the 2000s, like The Hitch, you've got, you know, all these CW stars. You've got Sophia Bush, who is like smoking hot in a very traditional way.
Yes.
You've got Micah Monroe that feels like the sort of edgy girl as well. Like, and I think it fits very much into the style of these types of movies and what they're going for.
Yeah, you couldn't quite imagine her in the 2000s, you know, kind of low-hung jeans and white vest, right? Like the Eliza Dushku,
exactly.
Like that
the
lot. It's something
tank top horror.
There's something slightly different. I could almost imagine her, maybe it's the fact that she works in a diner in this, but I could imagine her in like a Twin Peaks or a David Lynch cast.
Spot on.
Like, there's something about her look, it's a throwback, there's something that's just a little bit off, right? Left field about her, which is perfect.
It's you know what? She just has it. I think that's it. Like, we can talk about looks and we can talk about acting and we can talk about, but there's just something with certain actors where they're just captivating on screen, and she just has that something that fits so specifically and so perfectly within this type of genre. And like, how fortunate of her as an actress to find this so early in her career, because again, this is something, you know, regardless of what she does next, this is something, like Dan Stevens, she'll always be known for.
100%. Now let's talk about this bonkers plot for a minute. Like, what is it exactly that David has been like a military experiment, like a medical experiment or something, right?
Yes.
Like, what's all this nonsense?
I quite like that they don't over-explain it, but I think it's something along the lines of what I imagine is they're trying to experiment and maybe create like some form of super soldier or something like that or whatever. and he escapes because doesn't want to be trapped within this thing anymore. But he's almost like a sleeper agent, and so
that's right.
He's been programmed to not only protect himself but also protect the secret of this experiment as well. And you can see that conflict happening when he interacts with different characters throughout, which can be quite fun and funny a lot of the time. But yeah, it's absolutely bonkers. I'm glad they give you just enough. They give you just enough sort of, MacGuffins and phlebotinum and all of that stuff to kind of go, okay, that's it. That's what we need.
Yes.
Let's have a banging third act.
Absolutely. Let's talk about that banging third act, shall we, finally? Because like you mentioned at the beginning, didn't you, that this kind of feels a bit Halloween, a bit Terminator. I think that's spot on, right? There's something about him that is quite Terminator. I mean, I guess Terminator, James Cameron made that because he wanted to make something like Halloween, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But there is something Terminator-y about him and about the way, especially that final act, right?
Yeah, it's the combination of having the unstoppable killer, which he's sort of doing, but in a way that feels closer to action or sci-fi than it does specifically to horror.
Yeah.
But the setting on Halloween, because there are pumpkins in the background of every scene, which I adore. And the opening shot, actually, of the pumpkin and that sort of like bluey skyline just reminds me very specifically of the opening credits to Halloween 4, which I love that vibe that gets created in that movie. I think gets recaptured here, and I think that's very specific. And it's so funny, like we were saying before, try as he might, like, this isn't really a horror movie. It borrows so many things from horror, and its third act in the sort of haunted maze at the high school is 100% horror, but big picture, the whole thing really isn't. But it loves horror. And I think that's why it's horror adjacent, and it's very much welcomed into the horror canon with open arms, I think, for sure.
Absolutely. It is, because it's so much a kind of 80s, 70s cult classic vibe, right? And yeah, you're right. This movie, like I said about with Adam Wingard, like this film isn't interested in terror or tension or the uncanny or any of the, or even gore or the grotesque or all the things that we kind of think of with horror, really. It's just like a really cool, stylish, slick, fun genre exercise, isn't it, in that regard? But I do love that final act in like the Halloween maze. Amazing, right?
It's so good. It gives you everything that you want it to be. You get the setups and the payoffs. You get some really cool sort of spooky visuals. It's great. I laughed, actually. I think I sent you a voice note being like, one of the characters is like, oh, he's at the high school, they're setting up for the Halloween maze that they do every year. And it's like fabulous exposition setting us up, like literally at the end of Act 2, as we're about to tip into Act 3. We're just going to set that up right there. I think it's like the principal, or it's one of the teachers. It's like, he can just have detention. He can have detention. He can help the prom committee set up for, it's all of that. And it's like, brilliant. Set that up, honey, because I'm so excited for it. And all the smoke and the mist and the fact that he uses Anna's playlist mixtape as like background for the, because that, it's wonderful. It's so good.
It's so good. And the fact that it kind of ends up, like in the way that you said You're Next ends up being quite a different movie by the final act to what you think it's going to be. It's sort of the same with this, because, in that opening setup when he knocks on the door and speaks to that mother, you're not aware that it's going to end up being this like high school slasher movie by the end, right? Which it essentially is by the final act. It becomes a teen movie kind of, doesn't it, really? Which you don't necessarily think it's going to be in the initial setup. So fun. And then there's that very silly ending where he's the fireman.
Yeah, which I love. I like that both Your Next and The Guest do that.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't try and make sense of what's gone on, and it gets in and gets out real quick. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so it's like, oh, that's fun. Maybe there'll be a sequel. Boom. Like, and it leaves you there. It doesn't try and like close all the loose ends, and it knows exactly what it is and what it's trying to do.
And what do you think this film's legacy is, finally? Because again, I wonder if, like You're Next, this movie low-key has become quite influential on so much cinema and TV that we've had since,
Yeah, I think absolutely. I know that anyone I've recommended this film to loves it. I don't know how well it did actually, but I know that it was like low.
Yeah, it didn't.
Low budget.
It didn't do well actually. According to the Wikipedia, it cost $5 million and it made $2.7 million in the box office. So a flop technically, right?
But I know that it's very popular within genre fans, I think.
Yeah.
And for anyone that's watched it, that I recommended it to, that's watched it, they've all absolutely loved it. It's become a favorite. And like I said, you know, there's so much artwork and posters and stuff. I think its legacy is very much within its aesthetic. I think I think bringing up Drive was a good comparison actually. I think it's very inspired by Drive and that kind of style, but it's like lower budget and a little bit more indie feeling, I think.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of films that maybe have sort of emulated this since, where with Your Next, there's so many that you can go, oh, there's this and this and this. I mean, there's a little bit of The Strangers Pray at Night, just structurally, because you've got the four people in the family, and then the parents get killed, and then the two kids survive. So there's a little bit of that, but I can't think of any almost specific movies that this has actively influenced.
No, the only one that springs to mind, I mentioned it earlier, and it's not a big movie really, but Lee Whannell's Upgrade has that vibe as well, right? That kind of like very high concept schlocky genre film that isn't quite horror, but it's a kind of 80s throwback. But yeah, you're right, I think it's more the general vibe, and again, you could you know, boil this down to movies like Drive maybe, or It Follows More, but again, that otherworldly 80s world that this movie creates, that neon, synthy, crazy pink and blue and green vision of what the 80s look like. That's not at all what the 80s look like, right? But that is that really defined the look of so much genre stuff through the 2010s, you know?
And it's at that point before, because I think Stranger Things is the one that made, you could argue, made nostalgia like a bankable genre.
Made it mainstream in the way that Friday the 13th did to Halloween.
With slashers, exactly. And so what's nice about this is that you can rewatch it, and sort of the throwback 80s aesthetic doesn't feel disingenuous. It doesn't feel insufferable in the way that I think, you know, by the time we'd got after Stranger Things, anything that came after that, you know, even it was a huge success, but you can't help watch it and go, oh, they're just doing Stranger Things.
Totally.
You know, whether they were or they weren't, it doesn't matter, because Stranger Things came out before, and so you kind of go, and then you've got, was it Summer of 84 feels like, it's just doing Stranger Things. Like, this doesn't feel like it's just doing Stranger Things.
No.
It feels like a little bit of a prototype for what would come, and I quite like that, and I think that's what sets it apart. It doesn't feel like it's following the pack. It feels like it's leading it in a sort of underground kind of way, and a
little bit sexy. I mean, like, people often have complained, you know, that a lot of the stuff we've got over the last 10 years has become a bit sexless. This movie doesn't have that, right? This movie does, even though there's not a lot of explicit sex, as you've already talked about. It's a sexy movie, which is not something you get from, well, obviously from Stranger Things or It, because they're about children, but in general, right? In general.
Yeah, absolutely. It's strange how that's become a thing. I was thinking at the very beginning, at the beginning of Your Next, opens with a sex scene, and you know, you've got tits out, you've got, like, it feels like very almost exploitative 80s horror, and good, you know what I mean? Like, good. I think not everything has to, and these two films are a testament to this, actually, that, like, you can have style and substance, and things can be fun and sexy and sexual, and you know what? Exploitation isn't necessarily a dirty word. It's not a bad thing. Like, you know, bodies are beautiful. There's an aesthetic that I think that we can enjoy in cinema that doesn't have to serve a plot point or a character motivation. Some things can just look pretty. Some people can just be sexy. The camera can love to look at bodies and, you know, have killer lighting and have cool soundtracks and all of that kind of stuff without it having to further the plot.
Yeah.
Because that's entertainment. It's still entertainment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that. Well, we'll end on that note, on Josh pleading for more sex in movies.
Yes,
I love
please.
this. Let me finish by asking you, Josh, if it's not one of these two, what is your favourite home invasion movie?
Hush.
Oh, of course. What a film,
Mike Flanagan's
right?
Hush. I think it's my favourite movie of that year. I think it is expertly written. The setups and payoffs are effortless. It's really stylish. It's well acted. It has that wonderful element of Stephen King that Mike Flanagan brings to all of his projects. And it's so simple.
It's simple and it's creepy, right, as well. Again, It kind of feels like a really interesting next step on from, when you look at The Strangers on one end of the spectrum and You're Next on the other, Hush kind of feels like it sits in the middle of those two, right? Where it's got that entertainment factor of You're Next, but it's also a scary home invasion movie in the way that The Strangers is as well. Yeah.
And if you didn't know, Mike Flanagan would go on to do Gerald's Game and The Haunting of Hill House, in which he's very good at making sort of like characters' internal lives external. Like that happens in Hush, and it was all there from the beginning, and that's what I really like, is that all those elements that he would perfect and use later on in other projects and properties were there from the get-go in this one. And I think it never runs out of steam because it keeps reinventing itself as it goes on, and I think it's just a genius movie. I love it. 5 stars, no notes.
We're a mere 2 weeks out from House of Usher, Mike Flanagan. Josh, you excited for that one? I love this time. From now, I think of like the spooky time of year as also being the Mike Flanagan time of year, right? I'm like, yes, it's time for a new Flanagan. So excited.
Yes, I'm excited. I've not looked into it at all, and I think I won't. I just want to go in sort of like with, knowing nothing about it. Yeah, I'm excited.
Can't wait. Amazing. Well, Josh, thank you so much for joining me. As always, Thanks, a pleasure. Let people know where they can find you, where they can find more of your work and all of that kind of thing online.
Yeah, for sure. So I am at Joshua Tonks on Twitter, X, whatever the hell we're calling it, Instagram, Letterboxd, Tumblr. You can find me just at my name on all of those things. I'm on Blue Sky now. I'm trying that out. And then also my feature film debut, The Latent Image, is up for pre-order on DVD, as if it's 2007. So you can purchase that if you want to. If you like home invasion movies, there's a level of home invasion.
There is. And if you want a bit more sex in your movies, there's a lot of sexy sex scenes with Josh in that movie as well.
So yes. So The Latent Image is available for pre-order on Amazon or wherever you buy DVDs. And I think come October, we're going to be getting a little limited theatrical and possibly on streaming as well. So very exciting times ahead.
So exciting. Josh, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's brilliant guest, Joshua Tonks. I love discussing those two films. What a fun double bill. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which you can find on Facebook. If you want to come to any of the plethora of events that we've got going on in October, then head to our events page, evolutionofhorror.com/events. And if you want to be kept up to date with new events as soon as they're announced, you can sign up to our newsletter, evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then. And next week, we're continuing our journey through the 2010s. And next week, it's a little bit more upsetting and disturbing than this week's films. Next week, we've got a Blumhouse double bill. I'm going to be joined by Journey Through Sci-Fi co-hosts Matt and James. And we are going to be discussing The Purge from 2013, followed by Soft and Quiet from 2022. Oh my God. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.